Good morning, and thank you for agreeing to participate in this dialogue. You were each chosen as an integral part of this strategic dialogue, and because with the entirety of this group, we may be able to address the issue of humane, sustainable global supply from multiple perspectives, each important in its own right. We do have some seemingly incompatible needs within the group. Some, for example, Wayne Puccelli, your primary goal is to create as humane a world as possible for all animals. Others, such as Jack Scott from Nestle Purina, represents a company that absolutely has to provide a profit for its shareholders or it will cease to exist. And then we have Craig Morris with the U.S. Department of Ag. He's charged with ensuring the safety of our food supply. And then there are some hybrid companies, such as the Jackfruit Company, represented by its founder, Annie. Annie, I cannot pronounce your last name. I don't even want to attempt it, but thank you for being here. And while this is a for-profit company, it appears that the reason she created the company was to alleviate worldwide hunger while providing an economical, sustainable, plant-based meat replacement to the world. Very, very admirable. As you may see from the list of participants, and I think you all have that list, we do have a majority of nonprofits represented. However, the for-profit companies here have demonstrated a strong interest in combining their profit goal with a positive social impact mission. We appreciate that. For Nestle's and Hershey's, this mission includes humane and sustainable food production. How do they do this while still taking care of the balance sheet? How do they recommend that other for-profit companies combine and balance these goals? In addition, regarding animal-based protein, how does the company operate in a manner that does not degrade the environment nor abuse the animals it raises and slaughters, while still making a profit for its shareholders? What about the claims by some that we must use factory farming, GMOs, chemicals, and antibiotics in order to feed a growing world population? Does the fact that we waste over 50% of our food contradict these claims? Or I think sometimes it's called loss. And it is admitted that there has to be some waste, some loss, but does there have to be 50%? These are questions that I expect will be raised, these and more. Without the right question, we cannot reach a solution. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. To my right, Sue Ann has listed some fantastic questions to guide this conversation. A few housekeeping notes before we launch in. My name is Hanne. I'm Director of Social Impact here at Concordia. I'm so pleased to see a packed table. As you heard on the screen earlier, this is a new area for Concordia, and we're very pleased to be entering into the conversation. I'm very, very pleased to see so many esteemed names and groups represented around this table, and I think it bodes very well for ongoing discussions and the discourse today. Before we get started, a few things to note. First, the way this session is organized is designed to get the most interaction and discussion possible. So rather than having a traditional panel, we've identified several conversation leads who will provide brief framing remarks around an issue area, and then we'll dive into full discourse. If people aren't too chatty at the beginning, I have a few questions that I'll toss to the crowd, but I have zero doubts about this group. If you wish to contribute to the discussion, please flip your name tag, and I'll do my best to track it. When it's your turn, make sure you press the button on the microphone to make it activate, and then when you're finished, please turn it off so that nobody hears all your paper rustling. This topic, I expect it to elicit controversial and strong opinions. There's a lot of different viewpoints in this room. I encourage you to ask direct questions to one another as the conversation leads, to myself. But the goal of this conversation is to advance the discourse around food sustainability and to identify concrete steps all sectors can take. To that end, I encourage you to remain constructive and professional at all points. And I may at certain times exercise my authority as Assembly Chair. I've been told I've been allowed to call on new or different voices based on what I know about the participants here today. I've had conversations with many of you, and I know that there are a great many points that we're trying to get in, so we'll do our best to weave them at all points. Again, I expect it to be a robust conversation, and with that, I'd like to turn the mic over to Steve Guyver to kick off our ethical and human food supply agenda point. Steve?
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invite to be here in New York and for addressing this important issue. As it's set out in the notes for this session, there are more than 70 billion animals reared for food each year, not counting fish. If the current trend continues, this will grow by about 70% between 2014 and 2050, mostly in poor and middle-income countries such as South Asia and Latin America. As global wealth grows and people have more choice about the food they eat, people want to know more about where their food comes from and how animals live to produce it. For example, recent studies in Europe and China both reveal significant public concern for livestock welfare and an increasing wish to understand food production. The 2016 European Commission Eurobarometer reported on attitudes to farm animal welfare and showed overwhelming support for the importance of protecting farm animals. Most notably, 4 out of every 5 European consumers, and that still includes Brits, want better welfare standards, with 9 out of 10 believing imported farm animal products should also respect EU welfare standards, and 59% are willing to pay 5% more for higher welfare products. Go to a different part of the world. In China, a recent independent survey commissioned by our organisation found that almost 90% of consumers surveyed said that they would be willing to change their purchasing habits to move pork products, the biggest pig producing industry in the world, pork products, from pigs that have lived better lives, 90%. And almost 72% of respondents considered the welfare of farm animals to be important, and over 75% again were willing to pay more for higher welfare pork in China. Now, World Animal Protection wants to see all farm animals having a life worth living. We believe that all systems, big or small, can be built to ensure good welfare. But the biggest and most urgent challenges are in the large-scale industrial sector. Modern scientifically evidenced approaches to animal welfare focus on what the animal needs to have good welfare. It includes good feeding, good health, good housing, and importantly, the opportunities for natural behaviour. In industrial systems, straightforward improvements have dramatic impact. Animals free to move around, exercise, root, be social. None of those basic behaviours are possible in crates or cages, which is why they need to go. It is the major global food producers that ultimately have the influence, the resources, and the motivation to change systems for good. And they are increasingly demonstrating their willingness in the partnerships that we operate with companies like BRF, with Nestle, with Bettergrow, one of the biggest producers in Asia of meat chickens and pigs. And in the 2015 business benchmark for farm animal welfare, it reported that the number of leading food business with published farm animal welfare policies, objectives and targets has increased by 25% in just 4 years. Consumer and client demand are cited as the most important drivers for action. And in his foreword, Donnie Smith, President and Chief Executive of Tyson Foods, said, "We owe responsible farm stewardship to our suppliers, customers, team members, shareholders, and, most of all, the animals we depend on for our livelihoods." However, he also articulated the need for a joined-up solution to a highly complex global problem. So, if we're to tackle the global growth in the poorest welfare systems, we must consider how schemes can be applied both consistently but also globally. There are many labels and standards, but how applicable are they to complex global supply chains? And how effective are they at providing relevant, clear, reliable information to consumers wherever they are in the world? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm moving to our next conversation lead, Wayne.
Great, Hannah, thank you. And Sue-Ann, thank you very much for organizing us. And Steve, thanks for those comments. So I work for the Humane Society of the United States. We're an animal welfare organization, but one of our precepts is that the circumstance of animals is not disconnected from our circumstance or the planet's circumstance. And you know, we live in a time of great abundance with food. Obviously, people are food insecure in many parts of the world, and certain people have difficulty getting enough calories. But even in poor communities in the United States, ironically, we have obesity issues. And I think if we look back at our recent history, we of course recognize that we humans have always had a concern about famine and food insecurity. And if we look at the 20th century, we look at the US participation in World War I, where we had to produce food to feed our country, and there was concerns about food insecurity all over the world. That etched something in our psyche. The Great Depression really drove forward this notion of food insecurity when we had massive losses of crops and many people moved off the land. We go to World War II and food security was an issue. So coming out of the 1940s and into the 50s, we see a nation that was gripped with this idea of food insecurity. And one of the things we did is we began to apply industrial production methods to agriculture to address that food insecurity. Now that's a good thing at some level, because food insecurity is a bad thing. But what happened when we began to industrialize the production of animals is we forgot that these were living, breathing, feeling creatures. And we moved animals off of pastures where they could feel sunlight on their back and soil beneath their feet, where they could live in social groups that were appropriate to them. And in certain cases, with turkeys and laying hens and pigs, we jammed them in warehouses and then we put them in cages and crates barely larger than their bodies. And we had this sort of group of government, the USDA and state agriculture departments and land grant colleges and the industry groups, all telling us that this was okay. And of course, there was no malice intended. It was intended to provide cheap food, abundant food. But we cannot subordinate the interests of animal welfare and environmental health when we also honor these other principles. And I think as we look at our circumstance in 2016, I think we can look at industrial production of animals for food, factory farming as some might call it, and think of it as an example of human creativity detached from conscience. But what happens when we attach human creativity with conscience? That's the sort of production strategy that we need in the 21st century. You know, it was 45 years ago that Francis Moore Lepay said that animals are protein factories in reverse, where huge inputs of plant matter are required to produce a small yield of animal protein. From an animal welfare perspective, from an environmental perspective, efficient use of land and other resources, climate change, public health issues with the overuse of antibiotics, we must have a solution here. And our human creativity can get us there in the years ahead, whether it's companies doing incredible things with plant-based proteins or more humane farming practices. We need a pluralism of corporate concerns. We will certainly have a pluralism of societal concerns, but we've got to have a minimum standard. And we've got to honor these broad set of imperatives and not subordinate our core values simply to efficiency and production.
Thank you. And to our final conversation lead for this point, Lisa.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's an honor to be included in this discussion on humane and sustainable global food supply. I hope the experience from our work at Green America can serve this discussion. So that you know the perspective I come from, Green America is a 35-year-old NGO that works on marketplace solutions to the world's most pressing social and environmental problems. We focus on food, energy, labor, and finance, and we work on 3 strategic fronts: organizing consumers, innovative company, and large supply chain collaborations. These collaborations include the entire supply chain. For example, in our sustainable agriculture and dairy programs, from farmers and seed breeders to grain traders and distributors to food manufacturers and academic policy experts, investors, and advocates. Our experience is that all supply chain transformation starts with the customer. The customers demand it, the innovators show it can be done, and then it's time to work with the entire supply chain, including the biggest players, to scale those solutions. We applaud Concordia for this newest campaign on humane and sustainable global food supply. And in the course of this discussion, I'd like to throw 3 big ideas into the mix for this new campaign that you have. The new campaign encompasses the biggest crises of our time: global climate change, global water supply, and global soil health and food security. This campaign is a new opportunity for solving all 3. Sustainable agriculture, and people may have heard the term regenerative agriculture or carbon farming. This is so important because new studies show that over the past few years that the best crop and pastureland management practices can sequester enough carbon to actually reverse the climate arrow. Let me say that again. So many people, so many companies, so many countries are in despair because of the climate crisis and the water and food shortages around it. Yet the right cropland and management practices can actually reverse the carbon arrow. So the first big idea I'd like to throw into the mix for this discussion is that the Concordia's new campaign include carbon sequestration in their framework for a humane and global sustainable food supply. Not only can it literally save the world, but also with the coming carbon pricing, farmers could be paid for carbon sequestration services, and that would finance the transition to a more humane and sustainable food supply. Concordia's campaign is also brilliant, including in its focus ethical and humane food supply, with animal welfare as a key driver. Since so much of the food that we grow globally is for animal food, if you want a humane and sustainable global food supply, it's imperative to address animals and the food they eat. So take the US, for example. If you look at acres, the fruits and vegetables that we eat take somewhere between, depending on how you measure it, between 4% and 10% of the acres under management. That's it. All the fruits and vegetables that we eat, maybe 4% of the acres. When it comes to some major crops like, for example, soy, over 95% of that goes to animal feed. Only 5% goes, less than 5% goes to ammonia and tofu and so forth. Corn, a very similar story. Only 10% of corn goes to human food, and that's if you include high fructose corn syrup and corn texturizers. Big definition of food there. The remainder, about half of it, goes to animal feed and the other to fuel. So, and in all of this, central to animal welfare is the food they eat. One of our major programs is working on humane and sustainable dairy supply chain, and that means I get to spend a lot of time on dairy farms. As many of the farmers we work with puts it in their succinct and compelling way, everyone knows the true saying, you are what you eat. That means you are also what the animals eat. So take the US dairy industry, for example. We have an epidemic of sick cows and herd health. US milk quality is amongst the lowest in the industrialized world. And as a result, dairy production costs are skyrocketing. We literally cull 42% of our cows every year out of dairy production and into beef because they're not healthy enough for dairy production because of the way we're treating the animals. Coupled with current low commodity milk prices, the dairy industry is in crisis here and across the world. Many industry forecasts report that over half of small and medium-sized dairies, so around 500 cows and lower, will close in the next 5 years. The picture doesn't look much better for big dairies. Herd health there is even worse. As you go west in our country, dairies get bigger and bigger, and with the water scarcity issues in the west, the big dairies that you find there with over 10,000 and more cows are unlikely to be there next year and the next decade. So for companies making yogurt, milk, ice cream, cheese for consumers, this threatens their supply chain. And since, depending on where you are in the country and in the world, 25 to 50% of the beef we eat comes from the dairy industry, this threatens the beef industry as well. But there's some very good news. There are thousands of dairy farms that are switching to whole systems, humane and sustainable approaches that include high animal welfare, cow comfort practices, no growth hormones or therapeutic antibiotics, sustainable cropping practices, and provide fair wages to farm workers. Taken all together, these practices make their farms more profitable by $1,000 to $1,700 per cow per year. In a small dairy operation in the U.S. of 100 cows, that's $100,000 on a dairy farm. That's doubling their profits. On a farm with over 1,000 cows, that's $1 million. Real change. The dairies that are doing these sustainable practices are thriving, and they're the ones that are likely to be here in 5 years. So that leads to the second big idea I want to throw into the mix here, that there's a significant business case for making the global food supply chain humane and sustainable. And without sustainability, there may be no global food supply chain. Finally, I want to affirm Concordia's hypothesis that consumers who eat meat care deeply about animal welfare. And for two reasons. They care about the animals, and they care about the health of the meat they eat and the milk they drink. They don't want it to include growth hormones, antibiotics, and the pesticides and herbicides from the plants that the animals eat that end up in the meat and the milk. All the publicly available data show this. Nielsen, which does a global study on consumer interests around food, find that concern about animal welfare, growth hormones, and antibiotics are in the top 10 concerns of consumers in every country around the world. Here in the U.S., Hartman and the National Marketing Institute surveys also find that high level of interest, with over 90% of people who eat meat that care about how the animals are treated. All of the private data from the companies we work with, the largest consumer packaged goods companies in the world, show the same thing, and you can see it with market evidence. With companies like Arnall buying companies like Applegate with one of the best reputations for high animal welfare, and restaurants from Outback to Carl Jr.'s offering grass-fed beef options. So this leads to the third and last big idea I want to throw in the mix here, that with consumers demanding ethical and healthy food brought to the market sustainably, and with the innovative companies showing that it can be done profitably, now is the time to look at how we can all collaborate more deeply for global sustainable food supply that is just and humane. So a quick summary on these three ideas for the mix. With the promise of carbon sequestration, the emphasis on a humane and sustainable global food supply is more crucial than ever. That there is a significant business case for humane and sustainable global food supply. And with consumers demanding it and innovators showing the way, now is the time to look at deeper collaborations for humane and sustainable global food supply. In short, I hope that Concordia's Sustainable Global Food Supply campaign will be the most successful ever, and I commit to helping that to be so. Thank you.
Great, thank you all for those remarks. I will make myself one of the least popular people in the room at this point and identify that we only have 15 minutes left for this conversation. For that purpose, I would hope that we could really consolidate this discussion right now. I don't want to prevent it from happening because, again, the purpose of these strategic dialogues is to allow discussion, but we'll identify that there are 2 full days for side conversations as well. But if you do have some fantastic point to contribute to what has already been said and said so well, I would ask you now to turn your little table tents, and otherwise we'll move on to the second agenda item. Thanks. Alex, please.
So, my question is really about the gap between attitudes and behaviour. So in the research that we've done, we're seeing points like Steve mentioned, that people's attitudes around animal welfare are in a good place. 90% of people rate this as being an issue of importance. But when we marry that quantitative research with people's purchasing behaviour, what we see is that their actual behaviour at the point of sale is quite different. You know, often people who say that animal welfare is very important to them and it informs their purchases will be buying, not free-range eggs because they're cheaper. So then, there being that gap between attitudes and behaviour, what do you see as the major challenges around affecting actual behaviour change in consumers, which then creates a market demand to change an industry?
Alex, is that directed to any particular individual?
I suppose I'll throw it open to the floor, if anyone's got a strong view on that.
I think it's a great question. I think the idea between what somebody says on a survey or the view they hold for themselves and what they do in a grocery store is a really interesting gap that deserves further exploration. Yeah,
So I think that is a very good question. In our research, we find two important pieces of that puzzle. First, that consumers are very confused about how to find what they're looking for. And I think one of the important things in any supply chain is to have really clear transparency and certifications or regulations that make it clear, because when consumers are confused, they kind of throw their hands up and just go back to value price shopping. The second thing is a really important challenge, I think, for supply chains is that consumers believe that they should that the food should be humane and healthy, and that they shouldn't have to pay extra for it. That they don't understand why, if the conventional food product or the average food product, you see these statistics like 92% of the products on the shelf have X in them. They don't understand why the food supply should have that, and they actually feel like it's a responsibility of the supply chain to have the humane and healthy alternatives. Not a conversation about how that's too expensive, but figure out how to do it, please.
Thanks. We'll move very quickly to Shen, Priya, and Rupert in that order. And then I think we'll move on to the next discussion. Thanks.
It's interesting, the three conversation lead. I know this is the difference between, when I say, well, we need to keep the balance between efficiency and the animal welfare concern. Meanwhile, I think ALISA pointed out in concrete numbers that if you follow the more balanced practice, you actually make more money. So that's one kind of efficiency. But one thing in our study at Future, I'm a modern day trained biologist. So I always thought, well, industrial agriculture, industrial food may not be that tasty and maybe addictive, and all these issues like maybe not good for culture, and it just food is not enjoyment anymore, it may be more an addiction, but at least it's efficient. So what we realized in the last few years is actually highly inefficient, not only in terms of profit making, but it's just to look at one single macro number is that smallholders, nature-based farming uses about 1/4 of the global resources and feed 3/4 of the global population. The reverse is true for industrial agriculture. So we'd love to throw on the floor and see commenting on whether it's actually efficient with industrial agriculture and food system.
So I love that question, Alex. I think it was a really good one in terms of willingness to pay. And I think the key to that question is that people are not going to buy something they don't understand the value of. So some of the research that we've done with Jason Luskin, ag economist out of Oklahoma State, basically looked at simple tagging at the grocery store and associating tagging with a very, very brief definition of cage-free, a very brief definition of free range, a very brief definition of battery cages. And we found that when there was, kind of a bright color highlighting each thing and explaining what it was, the lowest cost cage-free option became the highest bought product. So consumers really are, as you were saying, they're very confused, but they also don't understand the value of why people should buy cage-free or free range or battery eggs. So I think a lot of that really comes down to educating people at the point of purchase, if that makes sense.
Hello, Rupert Howes, Marine Stewardship Council. I have to say I do feel the odd fish in this convening. The Marine Stewardship Council is the world's leading certification and labelling program for wild capture fisheries. It's pertinent to this debate because seafood, about 100 million tonnes of fish and shellfish are drawn from our oceans every year. 60% of those fisheries are overfished or fully exploited, or rather I should say 60% are fully exploited, 30% are overfished and depleted. And we're struggling, as we all know, to feed 7 billion people, and we're heading to 9 billion people. So oceans are a critical part of this debate. 3 billion people on this planet depend on seafood for their main source of animal protein. And the UN estimates about 17% of all of our animal protein needs are met from the oceans. But to the point about consumers, MSC is nearly 20 years old. The way we've approached this is trying to link sustainable production with sustainable consumption through a credible certification and labelling program with full traceability. To begin with, consumers weren't aware, and the way we've tackled this, and we're operating in 110 countries around the world, is to work with the major buyers to get them to build sustainable seafood procurement into their policies. And gradually, these guys choice edit. Consumers, when they're given that information of the label, point of sale material, they begin to understand what this means. So now, over those 20 years, we have 10% of the global harvest, 10 million metric tons of seafood in the program, and a market worth about $6 billion. At the end of the day, the numbers don't matter. What really matters is the growing evidence base that this is driving change. So the key is engagement with major buyers, choice edit, information in store, engage your consumers, educate your consumers, and I believe you can get a self-sustaining momentum, which we're seeing more fisheries coming in as the market for non-sustainable seafood dries up. I'd love to talk more, but I know you're short of time.
Final thoughts?
Just being the one representing the public sector, one thing that we have seen time and time again, and this is timely for us today we start our first market news report for cage-free eggs, which will go alongside our market news reports for California produced eggs, which go through at least an enriched colony cage system, or organic eggs, or conventional eggs. As we've seen these areas, be it responsible use of antibiotics, gestation-free pork, the ability of the public sector to provide market information to producers so that they understand basically what prices they could obtain for that method of production provides them with really valuable information as to whether or not they can get into that business to begin with. And then what we've always seen is we've provided that market information, that delta between conventional and whatever that niche is, be it cage-free, is always decreased. Efficiency comes to bear as more and more producers become engaged in that line of work, and effectively it becomes the conventional. And that's what we're starting to see time and time again. Fears about enriched colony cages in California, that this would result in substantially higher egg prices for consumers in that state, never do really truly bear. What we always see is more producers coming into an industry actually bring the efficiency so that willingness to pay almost becomes a historical footnote that really doesn't become the issue long term.
I think that's a fantastic point to end on, and how important it is to move forward in partnerships and collaboration, bringing in more businesses across similar goals and objectives to make it more available and affordable for all. We are going to launch quickly into the second agenda point. We will start with Jesus, move on to Walker, and then finally close with Willy. I'd ask our conversation leads to keep their remarks tight so that we have a little bit more time for discussion. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'll promise I'll be brief. And thank you for the invitation to this dialogue, Feeding the Future. I should say sustainably. It's something that in Monsanto we spend a lot of time every single day with our farmer customers. I think the challenges that we face in agriculture over the next couple of decades are daunting. On the one hand, we have limited natural resources. On the other hand, we are fighting food insecurity. And then you have climate change, just to make things more interesting. We're all familiar with the numbers. We typically think about 2050, 9.5 billion people. But I like to think about a shorter period of time. Think about 2030. 2030, by 2030 will be 8.5 billion people. So that's about 1.2, 1.3 more billion people in a little planet. Middle classes will double to 5 billion. So that means that we need to produce more food, in the range of 50 to 60%. Numbers are really, really overwhelming. And we have to do that sustainably. Think about 2030 means 14 years to get there for farmers. Farmers get one shot every year to produce more food. That's 14 crops, counting this year, to produce 50 to 60% more food. So when you get your head around that, you get the picture of how important this is. Probably the biggest challenge that we face in our times. but also probably the biggest opportunity that we face in agriculture in our times. This week is Climate Week in New York, so leaders from all over the world, all sectors are gathering here to talk about climate change. And when I think about climate change in agriculture, I think it's fair to say that agriculture is probably one, if not the most affected industry of climate change. We're not only affected, but we also contribute to climate change. But I also think that agriculture can be one of the biggest solutions to climate change. ALISA made a great point earlier on carbon sequestration. So we're working really hard in our company on 3 fronts. The first one is we've committed by 2021 to be carbon neutral. That means that all of our operations will be changed to be far more efficient. And we're also working with farmers in collaborations to be able to sequester carbon from the atmosphere to get there. The second is we all know that certain agronomic practices make more efficient the sequestration of carbon on the farm. So cover crops, no-till are really, really important. And when you think about it, there is an opportunity to really make agriculture completely carbon neutral. Agriculture has potential to store more carbon under the soil than the carbon that it emits. So next time that you're driving through that cornfield, think about those little corn plants as little trees that are doing their work to help the environment. That's really important. And the third area that we're working on is, it's not enough to do this in our own house and to promote good practices. We are working hard with farmers to scale this. So every learning that we have to drive carbon neutrality on the field, we're sharing it with farmers around the world of all sizes. That's the way to be able to scale this going forward. So this is just an example of how important innovation and collaboration is to really meet the challenges of feeding our world. Innovation is at the core of what we need in agriculture to be able to drive that solutions to that challenge. In our company, we've been working on innovation from advancing breeding techniques all the way to biotechnology. And it's just interesting that this year we are on the 20th anniversary of the launch of GMOs to the market. It's 20 years ago when we launched the first GMO here in the United States. And 20 years after, more than 18 million farmers are using this technology, taking the benefits from an economic and sustainability, environmental standpoint around the world. The GMOs are not enough. There's a lot of conversation, and it's ironic that we're still having a conversation about GMOs, and that just tells us that in our industry, in agriculture, and specifically Monsanto, we could have done a better job in talking more about what GMOs are and engaging consumers in that conversation. But GMOs is just a tool that, combined with other tools, really help farmers advance sustainable agriculture. What is really important in this conversation about innovation is that beyond GMOs, we're entering the digital era of agriculture. And when you bring together data science with breeding techniques, with biotechnology and agronomic practices, then you have a case to really be able to farm so precisely that sustainable agriculture is really possible going forward. That probably agriculture is going to be one of the most precise industries over times. Think about it. Today we have the ability to map every single field in the world and be able to provide recommendations to farmers almost by meter on their field, so that they know exactly what seed to plant, how much seed they need to put on their field, whether they need fertilizer or not, when do they need to irrigate any type of pesticides or water. So the precision that we're seeing in agriculture to be able to use only the resources that are needed, no more, is unbelievable. And that's, I think, the heart of this conversation is how do we keep working together with farmers, with the social sector, with the private sector and governments, to be able to advance these solutions and these collaborations to those that need it the most around the world, farmers, who are the ones that are the most challenged to be able to feed the world. Thank you.
Great, thank you. The Clinton Development Initiative works with several 100,000 smallholder farmers in Africa directly, working with them on training and access to markets. The work we do is at the same time encouraging and very frustrating. It's encouraging and frustrating because the problems that we see that face smallholder farmers are not overly complicated. And the solutions to those problems are both clear and available. So let me look at two sets of these challenges that we deal with and I think are consistent to smallholder farming communities around the world. The first is low productivity, created primarily in our view by depleted soils that farmers have to work with, by lack of access to quality seed, and by vulnerability to disease, and particularly at a time of climate change, to weather unpredictability. The second set of problems rotates around market access and a lack of efficiency in that market access. Logistical and infrastructure challenges and inadequacies, and then inefficiencies in aggregation and protection of crops post-harvest, which leads to this 50% plus loss of crops even post-harvest. The solutions are many. I think fundamentally it's a matter of taking technology that is available to us and has been developed and moving that technology from the research centers and the labs and make it, and pilot phases, and make that technology available to smallholder farmers on a broad scale. Looking specifically at seeds, and I'll stay out of the GMO discussion for the time being, because I think a fundamental problem is the access that farmers have to basic high-quality seed, whether it's GMO or non-GMO. That seed too often is too expensive for farmers, and distribution systems are inadequate and not in place. So the first solution is how do we get better seed to more farmers in broader use. On the soil depletion problem, climate smart agriculture and practices and techniques and new technology that support farmers to re-nourish and replenish their own soils by adopting modern practices that in many cases are ancient practices, but making sure that that's done, again, on a wide-scale basis. I don't want to get into the problems of irrigation and disease, that we could spend quite a number of days talking about those. On the market piece, I think there's a responsibility in the public and the private sector to look at what needs to be done to create these new efficiencies in the marketplace, starting with the availability of logistics and infrastructure. A tremendous problem, but I think it's a question of who's going to make that investment. What is the role of the public sector, both internationally and within host governments and local governments? And what is the role of the private sector to help drive that development of these efficiencies of value chains farther back down toward the farm gate level? It ultimately gets down, I think, to this development of public and private partnerships, finding companies in the private sector, many have represented today, that recognize that they can't simply sit and wait at their factories and hope that farmers deliver the crops at a level of quality and quantity that allows them to operate their plants, processing facilities efficiently, rather than at 30 or 40% capacity, or capacity levels that are very difficult to predict. And then finally, I think that there's a great responsibility that we all have to recognize that ongoing subsidy is not a sustainable element in these critical value chains, but there is an opportunity, especially from the private sector, for target support, whether we call that subsidy or not, but target support that encourages farmers to grow crops that are needed for the value chains and to help support the development of this infrastructure and capacity and logistical ability to both gather those crops in the proper volumes, protect those crops, and deliver them so that there is a financial and economic efficiency in the market that the private sector demands. Thank you.
Well, hello everybody. Morning, I'm Willie Foote. I lead a social enterprise called Root Capital. And I'm going to echo a lot of what Walker just said. He and I should have coordinated. I'm basically high-fiving the air on his comments around aggregation and smallholders. I think we tackle the same problem that a lot of folks are concerned about, which is half the world's poor are rural farmers, and they're disconnected from the formal economy and the networks of opportunity that it creates. And so our organization, Root Capital, helps to raise income and stabilize employment and improve livelihoods for small-scale farmers in Africa, Latin America, Indonesia. And we do this by building financial management capacity and then investing in agricultural businesses that bring farmers together by the hundreds or thousands and collect their crops, process their crops, and link them to global international markets. So it's a unique combination of capital and training and strengthening trade partnerships to help businesses grow and to have impact. And in the context of how do we enable efficient partnerships to meet food demand for the future, again, building on Walker's points, when Africa imports $25 billion in food annually because markets in certain places aren't working very well. And so a lot of us, when we think about agriculture in Africa, we think of a woman in the field tilling the soil with a hand hoe to eke out an existence, and that is subsistence farming. And yes, it's still frustratingly present across Africa and much of the world. But imagine that woman with greater access to inputs like quality seed and fertilizer and technology and training and capital and markets, that she becomes part of an exciting and complex value chain that goes way beyond the narrow focus on farming to become a driver of industrial transformation, right? And that includes value-added processing and packaging and cold storage facilities to ensure that food gets from the farm to consumers. And my point here is that agriculture is particularly well suited to entrepreneurial development, to technological innovation. And if we support agriculture like we support other sectors, we can pretty quickly replace the image of the impoverished farmer working the land with one of high-impact businesses that enable farmers to earn a decent living, to feed local populations, to become kind of the economic backbone of entire countries. And in that context, back to Concordia, what's so important about public-private partnerships is that USAID, USDA, OPIC, the Gates Foundation, other sources of public capital are so uniquely positioned to work with the private sector and entrepreneurs, investors like ourselves, intermediaries, to basically who are deliberately operating in like the fuzzy gray area between the traditional poles of government-led and business-led solutions, and that are targeting places where commercial markets are not working and where we really need to blend public dollars efficiently with private capital to make those markets work. And so I don't want to reiterate everything that Walker said, but basically for us, the most important thing, and the question around feeding the future, is what's the sustainability vision for smallholder farmers, right? And what's the path to significantly increasing productivity of smallholder farmers? And it really comes down to aggregation. How do we sustainable intensification and aggregation of the small-scale farmers? We know what the productivity-related constraints are. Walker mentioned them. But there are a lot of non-productivity-related constraints, which are around aggregation and building businesses. So, yeah, I think I'll leave it at that, because Walker stole my thunder. The big thing is, for us, working in public-private partnerships with Partners in Food Solutions, many of you know, which is General Mills and Hershey's, CARGILL, some of the biggest agri-food companies. We're providing knowledge and sharing know-how in food technology, really focused on the aggregators that are the agribusinesses, and working with some of the biggest coffee companies in the world to provide support in response to a crop disease called coffee leaf rust. Again, very much focused on those aggregators that Walker mentioned.
It's very obvious from the discussion we've had so far that we have enough expertise in this room to solve the problem. One of the problems, though, that I don't hear us addressing is if the population is going to increase by 1.3 times in the next 20, 30 years, we're making 1.5 times too much food, up to 2 times too much food. Maybe we've already solved the problem of enough food. Maybe we do, as Willy's talking about, we need to get the social entrepreneurs, the technological ideas advancing how we handle the food that we have so that there are no hungry people, because obviously we have enough food. That's what I'm getting from this, that we do have enough expertise here. You all know everybody in the world. And working together, I don't know what the next step will be from here, but we'll figure it out. I think you can solve the problem. Thanks.
I think Susan's leading to a really great point as we try to use this dialogue to identify value adds that this campaign can have. I think the idea around, and this is my own personal perspective and because of my position also part of Concordia's perspective, but the value of looking at food access and food distribution alongside food waste, alongside growing food needs in various areas, and how public-private partnerships provide a possible platform to help kind of square this very, very real challenge that Jesus alluded to, but also there's so many solutions in this room right now. So I'm thrilled that Willy brought up one of the partnerships that he's working very closely on with General Mills Cargill. But I'm eager to hear about other initiatives taking place. And to that end, I'll turn straight to Elizabeth with Cargill.
Well, I wasn't prepared for initiatives, and I could speak. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Good morning, Elizabeth Fay with Cargill. So I guess I'd like to pick up on some of the comments of the earlier speakers. At Cargill, we really believe in order to address global food security, the food must move. There are areas of surplus globally, food production, and there are areas of clear deficit. And while we're working on that balance, the thing that will be most important is to keep markets open. Oftentimes, in times of turmoil, strife, conflict, and famine, you do find national governments taking actions to close markets, and that is something that is not going to support food security. We believe that in order for the global food system to be working efficiently, you do need agricultural value chains that are supporting the success of small, medium, and large actors, that they are working harmoniously and coexisting. Not one actor can solve all of the problems, and each market will have its own unique solutions. Key to all of this is the correct enabling environment, whether that is a regulatory and legal framework that is keeping food safe or humane or sustainable, or it is a framework that is supporting the key services and needs of farmers, whether they are small or large. We do need innovation, but particularly in areas of sub-Saharan Africa, tremendous productivity gains can be just addressed by simple technology and getting these farmers linked to the market with access to finance, access to quality inputs, and knowledge. Knowledge is the most important change agent for these small subsistent farmers. So I could talk about Cargill's work globally. I mean, we are working in over 70 countries and working from the smallest, 1.5 hectare to, 30,000 hectares. And farmers all have a common interest in feeding themselves and feeding their communities. But but they do need core common services. Thank you.
Thank you. For more on CARGILL's work, there will be a plenary session with their CEO, David McLennan, tomorrow afternoon in Plenary West. It will also be live streamed for those of you who aren't able to come to both days. We are going to do a challenge right now. Pretend you're on Twitter, and we will rapid fire go to everybody whose names are up in this order. Starting with Leslie, 140 characters or less, a question or a point, please.
Quick comment. Many of these activities already exist. So, for example, World Animal Protection works in the Global Agenda for Sustainable Livestock. And it's a place where you would never have imagined an animal welfare organization, an advocacy organization, working with people like the International Meat Secretariat to develop, through an FAO-led agenda, an approach to sustainable livestock which ensures the win-wins and the attention to all of these issues. So World Animal Protection there has brought animal welfare into the agenda, but we have to look at environment, livelihoods, and the framing of this, fundamentally, is a platform to bring people together and to deliver against the Sustainable Development Goals. So to deliver a food-secure future. And that, I think, is the framework whereby we have to answer these questions together, and we have to bring issues like animal welfare into the mix. If we look just at intensification, or we look just at climate change, we're not going to find the solution that is going to work, whether you are a small farmer in a developing country or a major industrial producer.
Perfect. Thank you for bringing in the SDGs. Brinda, 140 characters.
So I don't use Twitter enough to know this is exactly, but I'm trying my best. So a few things that really stuck out to me were the combination of human creativity and conscience to address a lot of the things that were mentioned. So a lot of us know, based on our various expertise, that the USDA has set this goal to reduce food waste in half by 2030. But if we're looking at 8.5 billion people in 2030, maybe the challenge is not to produce more, but to waste less. So how do we do that? How do we, at least on my level, what I do is reduce food waste in the third ward community in Houston, and the way we're able to do that is because of a tri-sectoral partnership. So I attended CGI, I go to a university, and we are listening to the community because we want to, if you know the story, avoid hippos. So how do we consciously make an effort to listen to the people we're serving and serve them in a way that is sustainable, that's engaging the youth? Because I think one thing that we all have in common is our expertise in our various areas, but a lot of what other people lack outside of this room is the awareness. So why does sustainable farming matter? Why does recovering ugly produce matter? And why is food waste such a prevalent issue if we have so many hungry people, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but across the United States? But we have 40% of our food that we're wasting in stadiums, football stadiums of food. So I think, at least on my perspective, addressing food waste as an initial starting point can lead to awareness to other issues as well. But it just starts with an idea and implementing it via action.
It's great. It is a two-sided coin. Unfortunately, we have 15 minutes left in this discussion and a whole other agenda point to get to. I'm very, very sorry. But I think we do have to move on. And we are starting in this rapid fire with JOYJIT.
Thank you, Hannah. Good morning, everybody. We've talked about challenges ahead of us in terms of food production challenges, and I know that in the next 30 years, UN scientists tell us that we have to double our food production. And this is obviously happening to be able to feed about 9 billion people, expected around 2050. And around this backdrop, we have advanced economies which have pretty much maxed out their capacity to produce, and regions like Asia, which have benefited tremendously from the Green Revolution, are either starting to see plateauing off or declining production on the food production side. Recent example was the Indian Prime Minister traveling out to Africa to buy pulses and long-term contracts to feed the growing populations in Asia. And everybody's looking at Africa because Africa has 65% of our arable lands. There's a lot of fresh water available, though 95% of that water is being wasted in runoffs. So, but the potential is tremendous there. But while we recognize that we do have to meet the challenges of increased food production, we can certainly do it in a sustainable manner by focusing on soil health, better seed selection, water management practices, the discussion around the wastage on the food production side. 40% of our production does not even reach retail ends because of post-harvest issues. So addressing post-harvest issues, looking at biopesticides, and Alyssa talked about regenerative agriculture, looking at that as an option as well. WinRock promotes both conservation and sustainable agriculture in our programming. And for example, in Nepal, we're working in investing heavily in this post-harvest reduction chain, because with better storage and better movement in that supply chain, again, a lot of speakers before me talked about the fact that a lot of food is being wasted. A lot of food is being wasted even at the farm to production level. In countries like Bangladesh, we're working with aquaculture farmers, and in the dry season, they're growing rice using fish as food waste. And so conservation in agriculture, sustainable agriculture, is certainly being used across the world in programming, a lot of it being funded by USAID and US Department of Agriculture as well. But the root of any sustainable food systems is good soil health. And I think Alyssa talked about the fact that if we're able to guarantee good soil health, it can be a medium of producing nutrient-dense foods, but also it can absorb greenhouse gases, retain rainwater, and filter and buffer pollutants. And we are working in the US, in the Midwest, through WinRock's Wallace Center, on a project that's called the Pasture Program, that is funding from the US Department of Agriculture, where we're working on exploring innovative market-based methods to improve soil health through adaptive grass-fed beef raising. And we're providing outreach to about 2,000 farmers, landholders, and working across about 25,000 acres. And we're going to be using these pilot learnings to expand these kind of programs as well. Now, it is clear through our discussions that the American food system is not working. Our diet is weakening population health, especially amongst our disadvantaged communities. Farmer businesses are struggling at this point, and climate change and declining soil health is certainly creating drought conditions, and which are widespread and growing. It is equally clear that increased food production is necessary to feed a growing global population. The tension between these truths has created a critical learning moment for us, where we need to learn from our history to create a 21st century food system that serves as a global model of sustainability, health, and prosperity. And what must we do to ensure that the mistakes that we have committed in the past are not repeated, especially at a world stage? And a lot of solutions are emerging. We heard about a lot of them here. That's at the intersection of public policy, public-private partnerships, around public policy initiatives, around market forces and social impact. And public-private partnerships are certainly tackling these challenges head-on and developing innovative and effective solutions to move us towards this. So I'm really delighted to participate in this document.
Thanks. We're going to move to Shen, who's hopefully going to, in the next 2.5 minutes, talk about some of those innovative solutions and trends. No pressure.
Good morning. My name is Shen. I'm father of 3 children, born and raised in New York. So that means it is very hard to feed them tasty, nutritious food in America. And doing so in a way that their children have the same chance, meaning that doing so in a sustainable way. And but besides that primary role, I'm doing also for 3 decades a social justice activist, starting with my radical student days back in China in 1989. Some of you may remember that the Tiananmen protest, which started my exile life in this country, and in the last almost 30 years, gosh, I picked up, among other things, academic training as a philosopher. So that means I tend to think about big, useless questions, such as our shared future, sustainable or lack thereof. And so food and agriculture is not only a personal issue for me on an almost daily basis, but in the last decade, anywhere I look, that basically most of the major challenges we as a human race faces, food is not only related, but it's central to that. I mean, it's not just food agriculture, but also, obviously health and personal wellness and environment. But you think about education, war, and transportation, and you name it. I mean, food is central to that. And in that sector, in that market, 90%, over 90% of the products are problematic. What do I mean by that? I mean that those food don't nourish our children, our own body, and they're not sustainable. It's very simple. So to do the math, this is a $5 trillion food and beverage alone, globally, $5 trillion market, and 90%. So we're talking about really huge opportunities that there's a non-sustainable system of this kind of scale. That means it's ripe for disruption. Like any market that's ripe for disruption, there's this groundswell of innovation and of entrepreneurial energy, especially in the last couple of years. So we all know that food is new black, right? And a good food movement is new black. And but it's interesting that in the food space, that most of the innovative companies actually they plateau at a certain level of revenue. That means a certain level of access impact. It's around a few $1 million, maybe $10 million, right? Where you have this mainstream opportunity that is multiple trillions of dollars, right? How do you bridge that? And the model in Food Future we find is that to use business acceleration. Some of you may or may not know this. Accelerator is a phenomenon that based on cohort learning, based on venture investment, based on mentoring, and that is one of the most fast value creation models that's pioneered by Silicon Valley. And at Food Future, we combine that with movement building mentality. So that means in our ecosystem, there are tens of thousands of entrepreneurs, innovators, domain experts, and co-investors, including impact investors, that form this launchpad for companies, and some of them are here actually in the audience. I'll give 4 examples that they're actually present here. 4P Food and Next Organics on East Coast. These are subscription and online aggregation platforms that makes community supporting agriculture available. So bypassing grocery shopping, and we have a vegan seafood company from Taiwan, Sophie's Kitchen, and we have a e-commerce platform that is from Colorado. That's for urban agriculture, including hobbyists that grow their own chickens and eggs. So it's a fun activity. So these are the kind of companies that really are driving paradigm shift. Many have been addressed, and I'll mention a few others that, for example, moving away from simple-minded modern communities of anyone just can get anything, anywhere, anytime, to a more nuanced, more wiser choices of local, seasonal, tastier choices, moving away from a simple-minded definition of productivity defined just by calorie and shelf stability, toward more wholesome, nutritious choices, and balancing industrial agriculture with time-honored wisdom and the resilience of nature, which is simply more efficient. So these are the kind of paradigm shift that really defines this unique opportunity, not only because of the sheer size of it, which rivals the internet revolution, but also because of the nature of it. I'll use this 4P Foods name, and then which says this all. That stands for profit, of course, it's business, but people, planet, and purpose. So big opportunity you can do really well by focusing on doing good.
Thanks, Shen. and looking at some of that efficiencies in food, we'll turn to Bruce, who will wrap us up. And when I go like this, that means you have approximately 10 seconds left before we are all asked to leave the room.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to that. So I want to thank Hanne and Sue-Ann for convening this panel, and thank all of you for participating in the panel. It's fantastic to get so many forward-thinking experts together in one room to talk about these various issues. I was asked specifically to reflect on, and I like the title of this, The Best Thing Since Sliced Bread, Trends and Technology. So I want to focus on two things that I think are the best thing since sliced bread in terms of food technology. And the first one is stealing from Eric Schmidt. So Eric Schmidt at the Milk and Global Summit a couple of months ago, he was asked to talk about 6 things that he thinks will transform life for humanity in a positive way by a factor of at least 10-fold in the fairly near future. And being CEO of Alphabet, of course you know that he had to talk about things like 3D printers and watches that know that we're sick before we know that we're sick, and self-driving cars. But the first thing Eric Schmidt talked about, and the only thing he talked about that's relevant to this panel, the first thing he talked about was plant-based meat. And he focused on plant-based meat as one of the things that will transform life for humanity, improve life for humanity by a factor of at least 10-fold, for 2 reasons, which are things that we've been talking about a little bit in the course of the last hour and 25 minutes. And the first is climate change. So as everybody in this room knows, 170-something nations pledged that they will keep climate change to under 2 degrees Celsius by 2050, and that is a scientific impossibility, according to Chatham House, unless we decrease our population's consumption of animal products. And Eric Schmidt says plant-based meat, because it creates exponentially less climate change than animal-based meat. So the least polluting meat is chicken, which produces about 54 grams of CO2 equivalent for every calorie. You compare that to legumes, it's about 2 grams of CO2 equivalent for every calorie. You look at protein calories and it gets even worse. So you're talking about plant-based meats produce literally 1/40th the climate change of animal-based meat, the most efficient animal-based meat. And then the second thing Eric Schmidt talked about was feeding the world. And again, animal-based meat is extraordinarily inefficient. The most efficient meat is chicken. It takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out. So multiple people have talked about the food waste as a big problem. We're throwing away something like 40 to 50% of what we grow. And it is a big problem. But think about the inefficiency of chicken. You're essentially throwing away 800% of what you grow. And that's the most efficient meat. You're throwing away 8 calories for every calorie that's consumed. So plant-based meat is the best thing since sliced bread, according to Eric Schmidt. When Bill Gates, an investor in Beyond Meat, tried the Beyond Meat plant-based chicken, he said, this isn't just a clever meat substitute, it's the future of food. And again, he was talking about climate change and he was talking about sustainability. It also solves the antibiotics problem, it solves the animal welfare problem. So plant-based meat, and then I would also just like to tag cellular agriculture. So actually growing meat from cells without the chicken or the pig or the other animal. And again, it's not quite as efficient as plant-based meat, but it's still 3 times more efficient than even the most efficient animal-based meat. So we can compete with animal-based meat on the basis of the factors that people actually incorporate into their dietary decisions. So 100% of people, everybody at this room, when you're thinking about what you're going to eat, you're thinking about taste, you're thinking about price, and you're not thinking about convenience, but if it's not convenient, you're probably not going to eat it. So we can either A, educate people and hope that on the basis of that education they incorporate sustainability and climate change concerns into their dietary choices, or we can actually create the products that compete with animal agriculture and then actually solve this problem
by competing with animal agriculture on the basis of the factors that actually are the reason that people make their food choices. Best things since sliced bread are the things that actually outcompete animal agriculture, and that's plant-based meat and it's cellular agriculture meat. And I would be delighted to have this conversation further into the break with anybody who's interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. And thank you, everyone, to summarize some of the great points made. First, we've connected food sustainability to some of the major challenges facing our generation and future generations, from the environment to access to water, the oceans. I mean, it's all connected, which I think makes it a beautiful subject for public-private partnerships. We've talked about some of the challenges from moving from ideals to action on the consumer side, about efficiencies. We've talked about where research would play a role, and where public-private partnerships, importantly, could play a solution. We've unfortunately been unable to really have the discussion that I think all of us were so eager to have, and that just bodes well for the future conversations we'll have, because that means there's plenty of subject matter to go through. There will be, there's a lounge outside. I encourage people to continue conversations. I want to briefly mention that people that I've really personally been looking forward to hearing from in terms of trends in consumption. We have renowned chef Chloe. We have Craig, who owns a vegan store, Terry. It's fantastic. I had lunch yesterday there. Can't endorse it enough. And then there's great work being done by the USDA, and our poor lone public sector representative Craig is in the hot seat, but they're doing some amazing work in this space. And then at a local level, trying to really enact some change on the ground. We have some transformation fellows here who are doing great things at universities and to really put practice into place. So please continue these conversations outside, and if there's anything that Concordia can do in terms of playing a convening role, let me know. Just to add, we have been capturing some of these remarks by the graphic reporter, and so please do review it on your way out the door, and this will be available in digital copy. So I hope everybody who's been around this table and unable to see what's been captured sees all their ideals correctly reflected. Thank you, everyone, for participating.